Welcome, everyone. We acknowledge the land on which McMaster University was built is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. The territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this gathering place is home to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. Thank you so much, Dr. Nancy Fraser, for joining us tonight. We're really delighted at the Wilson Institute to have you share your insights into the perfect storm that the pandemic has represented for so many of us. For all who follow critical theory, socialist feminism, and the ideas of the transnational left, Nancy Fraser is a renowned figure. Her books have changed a generation's understanding of the complex past and contested future of global capitalism. And I'll just share the screen for a sec to show you some of the major titles. So, a really good introduction to Nancy Fraser's work is this wonderful interview called Nancy Fraser, Rebel Philosopher in Her Own Words. Warmly recommend it to you if you'd like to explore more of the kind of personal dynamics and the fascinating ways in which Nancy became such a pivotal figure for the transnational left. Here are just some of the leading titles from Nancy Fraser that she's brought out, I think, in the last few years. Remarkably productive scholar. Some of her earlier titles, equally formidable, are Justice Interruptus, Critical Reflections on the Post-Socialist Condition, which examines the impact of neoliberalism on the left. Fortunes of Feminism, From State-Managed Capitalism to Neoliberal Crisis in 2013, which charts a transition from redistribution to recognition in feminist thought. And more recently, she's brought out Feminism for the 99% with Cinzia Arruzza and Tithi Bhattacharya, which poses the question, will we continue to pursue equal opportunity domination while the planet burns? And The Old Order is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born in 2019, which examines the global ecological, economic, and social breakdown that has undermined any notion that neoliberal capitalism is beneficial for the majority. Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory, 2018, features a conversation with Rahel Gedi on how best to conceive and transform the institutionalized social order that is contemporary capitalism. Now, as I was saying to Nancy before we started, this would be a brilliant book to use for anyone who's interested in exploring the really complex critical theories around capitalism in a very conversational and accessible way. So in short, Nancy Fraser has long been a leading progressive feminist thinker for our times. So after her talk this evening, I will pose some questions based primarily on Capitalism, A Conversation, as well as a recent brilliant article in New Left Review. And then I'll open the floor to members of the audience. So over to you, Dr. Fraser, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that very generous introduction and for this invitation. I'm really pleased to be able to participate in this wonderful series. I know you've had many, many fabulous speakers. Only regret not being able to be there in person. So my topic, as you saw on the screen a moment ago, is the COVID pandemic, a perfect storm of capitalist irrationality and injustice. And I was prompted to think about this question because we are hearing so frequently nowadays that COVID-19 has served as a perverse diagnostic. It is lighting up all the fault lines of our society, especially fault lines of gender and color, of nation and class. And that is absolutely true. But I still believe that we do not hear enough about the social system that generates those fault lines, even though it's the same social system, I will suggest, that brought us the virus in the first place, and that is blocking our efforts to deal with it. So my proposal in this talk is, in effect, to stop tiptoeing around and cut to the chase. What the pandemic really diagnoses, I claim, is the deep-seated dysfunctionality of capitalism. Truth be told, as my title suggests, COVID is a perfect storm of capitalist irrationality and injustice. More than anything in recent memory, certainly than anything in my lifetime, it discloses the system's multiple contradictions: ecological, political, social, and economic. All of these contradictions are baked into a social order that incentivizes a profit-hungry class of owners to devour the essential conditions of their own existence, and what's worse, the essential conditions of our existence. It incentivizes them, in other words, to guzzle care work, to scarf up nature, to eviscerate public power, to wolf down the wealth of racialized populations, and to suck dry the energy and creativity of all working people. Those things that I just listed are, in my view, essential preconditions of production and accumulation, as well as of life on the planet. And that's precisely the rub. Capitalist society is structured in a way that begs the profit makers to gobble them up in order to fatten their own share prices, even while it absolves them of any obligation to replenish what they take or to repair what they damage. So the effect is not only to leave a trail of wreckage across the globe, but it is also to periodically destabilize the whole jerry-built edifice of capitalist society. That's my diagnosis in a nutshell. And what I want to argue here is that COVID offers a textbook demonstration of this proposition. The pandemic is a switch point where all of capitalism's contradictions converge, where cannibalism of nature, care work, and political capacity of peripheralized populations and working classes merge together in a lethal binge. Now, to see why, we need to revisit the concept of capitalism. Our received understandings focus too single-mindedly on the system's official economy. They identify the core injustice of capitalist society with the exploitation of free-waged workers at the point of commodity production. And they designate the system's defining irrationality as its tendency to precipitate economic crises. Now, these identifications are not so much wrong as incomplete. Capitalist societies do indeed generate class exploitation and economic crises as a function of their structural dynamics. But they also give rise to additional injustices and irrationalities, which are equally structural and serious, but which fail to appear on the radar screen of received understandings. These extra economic defects of capitalist society are deeply implicated, I'll try to show, in the present crisis. If we hope to interpret the latter correctly and figure out how to overcome it, we need to develop a new expanded conception of capitalism that foregrounds not just the system's economy, but the relation of its economy to its non-economic conditions of possibility. So let me just briefly mention 4 such non-economic conditions for the possibility of a capitalist economy. The first is social reproduction, or as many now call it, care work. Included here are all the activities that create, socialize, nurture, sustain, and replenish the human beings who occupy positions in the economy. You can't have a capitalist economy without workers who produce commodities under the aegis of for-profit enterprises. And you can't have them without caregivers who reproduce human beings in settings external to the official economy. Care work includes gestation, birthing, nursing, feeding, bathing, socializing, educating, healing, protecting, solacing. In short, everything essential to sustaining beings, namely us, who are at once biological and social. Now, historically, much of this work has been unwaged and performed by women, often in households, but also in communities, neighborhoods, and villages, in civil society associations, in public sector agencies, and increasingly, it must be said, nowadays, in for-profit firms, including private schools and private nursing homes. But wherever it's done, social reproduction is an indispensable precondition for the production of commodities, for the making of profit and the accumulating of capital. Yet, capital goes to very great lengths to avoid paying for care work, or failing that, to pay as little as possible for it. And that is a setup for trouble, because capitalist societies incentivize business to free ride on care work with no obligation to replenish it. They entrench a deep-seated tendency to social reproductive crisis, as well as a gender order that subordinates women. So that's number one. Now, a second precondition for a capitalist economy is ecological. Just as a capitalist economy depends on care work, so too it presupposes the availability of energy to power production, of material substrates, including so-called raw materials for labor to transform, and of sinks for absorbing waste. Capital relies, in short, on nature, in the sense, first, of specific substances inputted directly into production, and second, of general environmental conditions, such as breathable air, potable water, fertile soil, relatively stable sea levels, and a habitable climate. But here again is the rub. By its very design, capitalist society incentivizes the owners to treat nature as a bottomless trove of non-economic treasure, there for the taking and infinitely self-regenerating, not needing replenishment or repair. This, too, we have finally realized, is a recipe for disaster. Capitalist societies institutionalize a structural tendency to economic crisis, as well as profound disparities in vulnerability to the ensuing fallout. Now, those disparities point to a third condition for the possibility of capitalist accumulation, namely wealth commandeered from subject populations. Almost always racialized, such populations are designated for expropriation as opposed to exploitation. They are deprived of state protection and of actionable rights, so their land and labor can be taken without remuneration and funneled into the circuits of accumulation. Expropriation has often been seen as an early superseded feature of a system that piles up wealth by exploiting free workers in factories. But that's a mistake. Capitalist production would not be profitable without an ongoing stream of cheap inputs, including natural resources and unfree or dependent labor confiscated from populations who've been subjected through conquest, enslavement, unequal exchange, incarceration, or predatory debt, and who are therefore unable to fight back. It's been said that behind Manchester stood Mississippi, meaning that slave labor supplied the cheap raw cotton that fed the iconic textile mills at the dawn of industrialization. but the same is true today. Behind Cupertino stands Kinshasa. Cupertino, the headquarters of Apple. Kinshasa, where coltan for iPhones is mined on the cheap, at times by enslaved Congolese children. In truth, capitalist society is necessarily imperialist, continuously creating defenseless populations for expropriation. Its economy doesn't work if everyone is paid wages that cover their true reproduction costs. It doesn't work, in other words, without a global color line, dividing populations that are merely exploitable from those that are downright expropriable. By institutionalizing that division, capitalism also entrenches imperialism and racial oppression. There is finally one more, a fourth background condition for a capitalist economy, namely public power. Paradigmatically, but not only, state power. Accumulation cannot proceed, after all, without legal systems that guarantee private property and contractual exchange, nor without repressive forces that manage dissent, put down rebellions, and enforce the status hierarchies that enable corporations to expropriate racialized populations at home and abroad. Neither can the system function without public regulations and public goods, including infrastructures of various kinds and a stable money supply. Indispensable for accumulation, these things cannot be provided through the market, but only via the exercise of public power. Capital needs such power accordingly, but is also primed to undermine it by evading taxes, weakening regulations, offshoring operations, or capturing regulatory agencies. The result is a set of built-in tensions between the economic and the political, and a deep-seated tendency to political crisis. On the one hand, capitalist societies tend to produce crises of governance, in which the system destroys its own capacity to manage the problems it generates. On the other hand, it also tends periodically to precipitate crises of hegemony, in which masses of people defect from politics as usual. Now, in all four of these cases, capitalist societies, I've been suggesting, institute contradictory relations between their economies and the latter's non-economic conditions of possibility. These relations become visible only when we understand capitalism broadly, not as a mere economic system, but as an institutionalized social order that also includes social reproduction, nature, wealth expropriated from racialized populations, and public power, all of which are essential to accumulation and yet are depleted and destabilized by it. Viewed this way, capitalism harbors multiple crisis tendencies and structural injustices. Above and beyond its propensity to economic crisis, the system is primed to precipitate social, political, and ecological crises. Above and beyond economic exploitation, it entrenches gender and sexual subordination, racial imperial domination, environmental injustice, and denial of everyone's robust political freedoms. Largely invisible to received understandings, the full range of capitalist injustice and irrationality appears with blazing clarity when we assume the expanded view. That view, I want to suggest, provides the conceptual toolkit we need to parse the present crisis. The COVID pandemic, as I noted before, is a switch point in my interpretation where all of capitalism's injustices and irrationalities converge, where cannibalization of nature, care work, and political capacity of peripheralized populations and working classes all merge together in a lethal binge. So now I want to take a closer look at COVID and the present conjuncture. Now let's consider first nature, which, as I just suggested, is the site of the system's ecological contradiction. It was none other than capitalism's cannibalization of that vital support of its own existence and of ours that exposed humans to SARS-CoV-2 in the first place. Long harbored by bats in remote caves, the coronavirus that causes COVID-19 made the zoonotic leap to us in 2019 by way of some bridging species, possibly pangolins. But what brought the bats into contact with that intermediary and the latter into contact with us was the combined effects of global warming on the one hand and tropical deforestation on the other. Now, both of those processes are progeny of capital, driven by its hunger for profit. Together, deforestation and global warming eviscerated the habitats of innumerable species, triggering mass migrations, creating new proximities among previously distant but now distressed organisms, and promoting novel transfers of pathogens among them. That dynamic has already precipitated a string of viral epidemics, each passed from bats or some other originating species to humans via some amplifying host. We have AIDS, Nipah, SARS, MERS, Ebola, and now, of course, COVID-19. I hate to say it, but you already know it's true. More such pandemics will come. They are the non-accidental byproducts of a social order that puts nature at the mercy of capital. Incentivized to appropriate biophysical wealth as quickly and cheaply as possible, with no responsibility for repair or replenishment, those dedicated to amassing profit decimate rainforests and bombard the atmosphere with greenhouse gases. Hell-bent on accumulation in every era, but massively empowered by neoliberalization, they have let loose an escalating cascade of lethal plagues. Now, COVID's effects on humans would be horrific under any conditions, but they have been incalculably worsened by another strand of the present crisis, rooted in another structural contradiction of capitalist society, which has also been sharpened to a fever pitch in the neoliberal era. It is, after all, not just nature that capital has cannibalized in this period, but also public power. That too, as I suggested before, is an essential ingredient of its diet, avidly consumed in every phase of the system's development, but devoured with special ferocity in the last 40 years. And that's the catch. The political capacities we might have used, the political capacities that financialized capital has gorged on are precisely those we could have used to mitigate the pandemic, but no such luck. Well before the COVID outbreak, most states bowed to the demands of the markets by slashing social spending, including in public health infrastructure and basic research. With a few exceptions, notably Cuba, they drew down stockpiles of life-saving equipment, PPE, ventilators, syringes, medicines, test kits, and so on. They gutted diagnostic capacities. They shrank coordination and treatment capacities, closing public hospitals and ICU units. Having eviscerated the public infrastructure, moreover, our rulers devolved vital healthcare functions to profit-driven providers and insurers, to pharmaceuticals and manufacturers. Now, these firms, which are constitutionally uninterested in and unconstrained by the public interest, now control the lion's share of the world's health-related resources. The labor forces and raw materials, the machinery and production facilities, the supply chains and intellectual property, the research institutions and personnel, all the things which together determine our fates, individual and collective. Committed to preserving their profit streams, they form a private force majeure that blocks concerted public action on behalf of humanity. The effects are tragic but unsurprising. A social system that subjects matters of life and death to the law of value was structurally primed from the get-go to abandon untold millions to COVID-19. But that's not all. The collapse of already weak public systems converged with another structural contradiction of capitalist society centered on social reproduction. Always a staple of capitalist consumption, care work has been voraciously gobbled up by it in recent years. The same regime that divested from public health care infrastructure also weakened unions and drove down wages, compelling increased hours of paid work per household, including from primary caregivers. In other words, neoliberalism offloaded care work onto families and communities at just the moment when it commandeered the social energies we needed to perform it. The effect was to turn capitalism's inherent tendency to destabilize social reproduction into an acute care crunch. COVID's advent has intensified this strand of crisis too, dumping major new care chores on families and communities, especially onto women who still do the lion's share of unpaid care work. Under lockdown, as we know, childcare and schooling shifted into people's homes, leaving parents to take on that burden on top of others in confined domestic spaces ill-suited to those purposes. Many employed women ended up quitting their jobs to care for kids and other relatives, while many others were laid off by employers. Both groups face major losses in position and pay if and when they rejoin the workforce. A third group, privileged to keep their jobs and work remotely from home while also performing care work, including for housebound kids, have had to take multitasking to new heights of craziness. A fourth group, which includes both women and men, bears the honorific essential workers, but is paid a pittance and treated as disposable, required to brave the threat of infection daily, along with the fear of bringing it home, in order to produce and distribute the stuff that enabled others to shelter in place. Now, in each of these cases, the work of social reproduction, now swollen by the pandemic, still falls largely to women, as it has in every phase of capitalism's history. But which women end up in which category depends on color and class. So let's turn now to them. A built-in feature of capitalist society, structural racism infuses every aspect of the current crisis. At the global level, it colors the ecological strand as capital quenches its thirst for cheap nature by seizing land, energy, and mineral wealth from racialized populations, whom, as I noted before, have been deprived of political protection and actionable rights. Subjected variously to conquest, enslavement, genocide, dispossession by debt, and so on, these populations now bear an undue share of the global environmental load, disproportionately vulnerable to toxic dumping and so-called natural disasters, and to multiple lethal impacts of global warming. They now find themselves, no surprise, last in line for vaccination. At the national level, meanwhile, race infects, I actually wrote inflex, but maybe infects is just as good, infects the political and social reproductive strands of the crisis, as communities of color are denied access to conditions that promote health, affordable, high-quality medical care, clean water, nutritious food, safe working and living conditions. So it's no wonder that their members were disproportionately killed and infected by COVID-19. The reasons are not mysterious: poverty and inferior health care, pre-existing medical conditions linked to stress, poor nutrition, exposure to toxins, overrepresentation in frontline jobs that could not be performed remotely, lack of resources that would permit them to refuse unsafe work, and lack of labor rights that would permit them to win protections. Inferior housing and living arrangements that don't allow for social distancing and that facilitate transmission. Diminished access to the vaccine. Together, these conditions have expanded the meaning of the slogan Black Lives Matter, synergizing with its original reference to police violence and helping to fuel ongoing protests. Color, of course, is deeply entwined with class in the capitalist world system generally, and in the present period particularly. In fact, the two overlap considerably, as the category essential worker shows. If we leave aside medical professionals, that designation covers migrant farm workers, immigrant meat packing and slaughterhouse workers, Amazon warehouse pickers, UPS drivers, nursing home aides, hospital cleaners, supermarket stockers and cashiers, those who deliver groceries and take out meals. Especially dangerous in COVID times, these jobs are mostly low-paid, non-unionized, and precarious, bereft of benefits and labor protections, subject to intrusive supervision and relentless speed up. Although others hold some of them too, they are disproportionately filled by women and people of color. Taken together, these jobs and those who perform them represent the face of the working class in financialized capitalism. No longer epitomized by the figure of the white male miner, factory operative, and construction worker, that class now consists paradigmatically of caregivers and low-wage service workers. Paid less than the cost of its reproduction when paid at all, it is expropriated as well as exploited. COVID has exposed that dirty secret as well. By juxtaposing the essential character of that class's work to capital's systematic undervaluation of it, the pandemic testifies to another major contradiction of capitalist society, the inability of markets in labor power to accurately reckon the real worth of work. In general, then, COVID is a perfect storm of capitalist irrationality and injustice. By ratcheting up the system's inherent defects to the breaking point, it shines a piercing beam on all the structural contradictions of our society. Dragging them out from the shadows and into the daylight, the pandemic reveals capital's inherent drive to cannibalize nature up to the very brink of planetary conflagration, to divert our capacities away from the truly essential work of social reproduction, to eviscerate public power to the point where it cannot solve the problems the system generates, to feed off the ever decreasing wealth and health of racialized people, to not only exploit, but also expropriate the working class. We could not ask for a better lesson in social theory. But now comes the hard part, putting that lesson to work in political practice. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fraser. That was very, very stimulating. So I have a few questions I'd like to ask. And I think the first one is this. It really relates to your theme of crisis. And, I'm picking up the themes that you've raised in your lecture. You're really saying that there's a deep-seated tendency to ecological crisis at the very core of the capitalist system. This is in its DNA, in essence. There's a general crisis whose effects metastasize everywhere, shaking confidence in the established worldviews and ruling elites. And I really thought it was very pertinent that you used a quotation from Antonio Gramsci for one of your most recent books. The old world is dying and the new world cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. Well, few can doubt that we've passed through a world crisis in this pandemic with manifold morbid symptoms. But I wonder if there's a risk that crisis talk can paradoxically be both overwhelming and underwhelming both suggesting something so vast that it seems beyond our power to control it, like global climate change, are all so particular that the word crisis just seems to be a way to add juice to journalism, like the contemporary crisis afflicting the Montreal Canadiens, for example. In Capitalism, a Conversation, you yourself raised the question of the boy who cried wolf. And you remark, there's a kind of absurdity in the posture of those who repeatedly announce the imminent collapse of capitalism. And meanwhile, everything carries on just as before. Are you suggesting with your metaphor of the perfect storm, something like Gramsci's organic crisis, a mega crisis combining a host of more particular ones? And could a hostile critic charge you yourself with crying wolf?
Thank you, Ian. That's a very rich and beautifully formulated question. So I want to start. There are many different parts of it. Let me start with trying to distinguish the kind of loose crisis talk that you refer to. I don't know what's going on in Montreal, but yeah, we might talk, whatever it is. I know that it's meant to be an example of, the way people throw around this word. Let's distinguish loose crisis talk from a critical theoretical conception of crisis, which and here we have to, even before we say too much about crisis, we have to distinguish a crisis tendency, a tendency to crisis, from an actual outbreak, acute or otherwise, of crisis. So in critical theory, and you find this in Marx and in subsequent critical theorists, the idea is that a social system can have built into it tensions or contradictions that incline it to precipitate crises under certain conditions or absent other countervailing tendencies, right? And the thing is that when these crises erupt, and they don't erupt that often in my view, when they erupt, their roots lie in the social system itself, in the dynamics, as what's the word I'm looking for, as sort of triggered or facilitated by conjunctural developments, right, that arise. So the reason it's important to have a concept of crisis in critical theory is that we need it to distinguish between problems that are not deeply anchored in the social system and then can be fixed without a major overhaul of the social system on the one side, and those that arise precisely as a result of the working out of the dynamics of the social system, and which might require a more radical fix. As I said in the talk, my view is that capitalism as a system has built into it at least 4 or 5 distinct tendencies to crises. That doesn't mean that they're always in full flower, and it doesn't mean that they always coincide. And now we get to the part about organic crisis and so on. So we should distinguish between a sectoral crisis and a general crisis. A sectoral crisis would be one in which, let's say, one of these crisis tendencies has been sort of rumbling along, right, piling up dysfunctionalities, and until there's something, there's a real apparent social blockage. You could say that even though it didn't result in a full-scale collapse, you could say that the 2007-08 financial crisis, as we call it, was a sectoral crisis. It gave the appearance, at least, we could question this, but it gave the appearance of being confined to the terrain of finance. And you might have expected, as I did, that a rational response would have included some major restructuring of how finance works. That didn't happen. And so I suspect that there's still a ticking time bomb there, and we might not have heard the last of it. But in any case, that's a sectoral crisis. Now, what would happen, though, if all of the four crisis tendencies that I outlined here were to converge and burst into full flower at once? Then you would have a crisis of the whole social order. And I think there have been some of these, but very few. This doesn't happen a lot. So in other words, this is the boy who cried wolf thing would apply if one were saying it's always a crime. But I think we shouldn't be intimidated by that. There's a great, I'm kind of improvising here, but there's a great a cartoon that appeared many years ago that I've never forgotten in the New Yorker, in which some cows are standing around in a field, and one cow comes running up to them and says, "Guys, I just found out where hamburger comes from." And the other one says to him, "Oh, you leftists and your conspiracy theories." So in other words, let's not be intimidated by the boy who cried wolf talk into saying that capitalism doesn't tend to produce crises. It does. It's just that not too many of them have this spectacular form of a general crisis. And maybe there have been 3 or 4 such crises in the history of capitalism. The last one was certainly in the 1930s or 20s and 30s. I mean, there are those who would say that actually the whole period from the brink of World War I to the end of World War II was one long general crisis of a whole social order. My hunch, and there's no way you can know this for sure, except ex post, my hunch is that we are living in a period now where the ecological crisis is converging with this crisis of public power, with the crisis of social reproduction, and with the crisis of livelihood and work. So that doesn't mean, again, back to your boy who cried, doesn't mean capitalism is going to collapse tomorrow. If the previous crisis took a good 50 years to resolve, I don't know if we have 50 years given global warming, but this could fester for quite a long time. And there's no guarantee that it will be resolved at all, or in a way that would be at all desirable. So a crisis is just that. There's one other distinction that I would like to introduce, and that's the distinction between a developmental crisis and an epochal crisis. A developmental crisis marks the sort of breakdown of one regime of capital accumulation, like liberal laissez-faire capitalism or social democratic New Deal capitalism. It marks the unraveling of a regime that managed for a while to keep the crisis at bay, that managed to finesse or soften the tendency, the contradictions. When a regime unravels, here's where we get to the Gramsci language, there's an interregnum period, and that's when you get a lot of interesting political developments. All sorts of people begin to think outside the box. They're looking for something fundamentally different, for better or for worse, often for worse, what they find. But in the past, when such crises have happened, and they've been rare, they have been resolved not by the abolition of capitalism, but by the reinvention of capitalism in a new form. So liberal laissez-faire colonial capitalism, that crisis got solved through the creation of social democratic New Deal capitalism. The crisis of that got, I don't know if solved is the right word, but anyway, led to neoliberalization. And it's the crisis of neoliberal capitalism that we are living in now. We can't know whether the outcome, if it's resolved at all, will be a new form of capitalism or a post or non-capitalist alternative. meaning we don't know whether it's merely a developmental crisis in which capitalism develops a new form, or whether it's a genuinely epochal crisis in which the whole, we get some brand new form of social organization. Anyway, that's just a quick attempt to spell out some of the issues that I think are packed into your very rich question. But maybe to end this answer, I should just reiterate that my hypothesis, which I can't fully substantiate, is that we are in a period of general crisis. And much as I don't want to be a crisis mongerer, the global warming piece of it, to me, looks like a game changer. So, you know, we don't know. I certainly don't know what will happen, but I do feel something has to give, and the politics of our moment, which may go on for some decades, are going to be extremely rocky as the dust settles and we figure out where the world is going to go, if anywhere.
That's an incredibly helpful answer. And it's a brilliant segue into the second question, which is really more about neoliberalism as a specific way of organizing capitalism. I've been noticing that a lot of people are writing obits for neoliberalism. You get it from the international, unlikely suspects here, International Monetary Fund, Financial Times of all things, are saying, it's quite passé. We're not going to use that language anymore. A really prominent historian pundit writes, it's a bad brand at this time. And I can't think of anything more devastating in our hyper-commercialized society than to say something is a bad brand. Neoliberalism really seems to be on the skids. And yet, as a student of C.V. Macpherson, the political theorist of liberalism, I keep being struck by the links between classical social reformist, corporate, and Keynesian forebears of today's neoliberalism. And so to work with your metaphor of the perfect storm, after George Clooney, AKA Captain Klein, goes down with his ship, having disregarded all the better informed experts in his madcap voyage to Newfoundland's Grand Banks, can we really be sure that his successors will transform their hyper-competitive macho ways and limit their insatiable ego-driven drive to gobble up more and more stuff from nature? Or to go back to the metaphor of Adam Tooze, if neoliberalism has become a bad brand, can we really be sure its manufacturers aren't just going to stick a new label on the tin? So you argue in your in Capitalism, you say, as a hegemonic project, neoliberalism is finished. It may retain its capacity to dominate, but it has lost its ability to persuade. And I really hope you're right. And yet I fear you're wrong. As Tooze went on to remark, as a practice of government, neoliberalism is a far harder beast to kill. And if you think about neoliberalism as a structure of social interests, as a class project, it marches on unambiguously. So Macpherson might say that what made today's neoliberals so persuasive to people, and maybe they're still in a way persuasive, is that they repackaged age-old Lockean notions about property and the primacy of the individual and his possessions, which, unless those assumptions are put aside, will just keep on structuring our politics and our lives. These arguably toxic truisms persuade us still, in my view. So, are you really sure it's time to bid a dry-eyed adieu to the neoliberal age and its underlying individualistic assumptions?
Well, that's another great question, a very challenging question. I mean, just to clarify, I think that Tooze and I are in agreement. I think that we're both saying that it remains in force. The global financial architecture, the rules of the road of the world economy are neoliberal. Nothing has changed. It remains in force. What I've been saying is that it doesn't command the same level, anywhere near the same level of mass support. I mean, there was a time when all sorts of working class people in England and the United States, I don't know about Canada, thought that their living conditions were problematic because there was too much government red tape, and that the answer was more markets. I don't think anybody believes that now, or many fewer people believe that now. So that's when I say, that's what I mean when I say the sort of the two pillars of hegemony for Gramsci are force and consent. It has force, but doesn't have the same level of consent. And that's, you see that in all of the resurgent forms of populism, especially on the right, but in a few cases, populisms of the left. These are all, in one sense or another, protectionist, or at least that's how they campaign when they run for office. What they do when they get in power is another matter. But the sort of whole excitement around populism is that populist strongmen represent the idea that, I'm going to work for you. The state you're going to have it. The power of it is going to be mobilized and martialized to support and protect you. There's not talk about markets. So that's just an observation, really, about the sort of political zeitgeist, the ethos. Now, it would help, though, in this discussion if we tried to say a little bit more about what neoliberalism is, because it's a word, as you say, that everybody uses, and not everyone means the same thing by it. In my case, it has to do with every form, let me backtrack, every form of capitalism, whether we're talking about mercantile capitalism, liberal laissez-faire capitalism, social democratic capitalism, neoliberal, every form of historic capitalism has to, in some way or another, establish a relationship between the political and the economic, between production and social reproduction, between society and nature. These are sites of tension and contradiction by definition of any capitalist society. So, but there are, each regime has a different way of finessing, massaging, softening those contradictions. So neoliberalization can be well understood by contrast to the previous period of social democratic capitalism. So let's just go through each of those things. So the economy-polity relation is quite different. Social democratic capitalism relied on the Bretton Woods financial architecture to give states, especially wealthy states, of course, it must be said, a set of tools by which they could direct, steer, and manage their national economies through deficit spending, currency devaluation, all kinds of tools that allowed them to keep the social reproductive contradiction at bay, for example, by social spending, social insurance, all that kind of stuff. Neoliberalization took that away. We have a new relation between corporations and states now. And it had to do with it was precipitated by the dismantling of the Bretton Woods capital controls, the dropping of the gold standard, so on and so forth, which deprived states of this Keynesian toolkit. The exception, of course, is the US, because the dollar is world money. We can simply print more and more of it and can get away with murder, so to speak, in this realm as in others. But this is the previous regime, in a sense, empowered states to discipline capital for its own good. This regime allows markets and global investors to discipline states. Witness, the Troika's gutting of the Syriza government's attempt to not refuse austerity impositions at the EU. Just one example. So states, with the exception of a very few, are weakened vis-a-vis production, reproduction. The neoliberalism has been a huge change in the nature of labor markets. It has recruited women en masse into labor markets and has changed the whole relation of production and reproduction as a result. In place of the old family wage, one salary can support a family. You can have a full-time female homemaker. In place of that, we now have the so-called two-earner family, which may sound gender egalitarian and positive, but in reality, it is a system for draining more and more hours of time from every household with less and less remuneration, so that you've got, people running around from one job to another, et cetera, et cetera. And social reproduction is suffering. And that's the condition that the pandemic supervened on top of. It was already there. The nature part, we've got all the new enclosures of privatization of water, of all kinds of things, a whole new, just think about the difference in environmental regulation. I rarely offer the US as a positive example of anything, but we did actually lead the way in the previous regime in establishing the Environmental Protection Agency, and above all, the jewel in its crown was the Superfund. The Superfund cleans up toxic dumps by taxing petrochemical and mining corporations. This was not trading permits and offset using the market. This was using coercive state power. You dump the stuff, we take your money. So that, that's a shift in what environmental regulation means now. Anyway, I could go on and on, but what I'm trying to suggest is that if we think about what neoliberalization is from the standpoint of this enlarged view of capitalism, then we have to look at these fundamental four relations I identified and look at how they differ and how they more quickly, I would say, than other regimes of capitalism, unravel, how very quickly they lead to really out there disaster, unavoidable disaster. And it's hard for me. Look, all sorts of things that shouldn't in a rational world exist do exist. So neoliberal capitalism at this point has no rational basis for continuing. That doesn't mean it isn't and won't continue in the future.
Thank you. I'd like to now switch to your very bracing, far-reaching and controversial critique of what I would call the existing left. And I'd like to take up its three components in turn of your, I guess I would say it's both an explicit and implicit critique throughout much of your recent work, especially in the Capitalism book. First and most controversially, perhaps, you present a sharp critique of actually existing feminism, at least in its predominant modes. Liberal feminists, along with many LGBTQ plus leaders, bought into what you explosively call progressive neoliberalism. Lean in and break the glass ceiling corpus. Feminists offered charisma and excitement to what remained a highly oppressive system for the majority of the population. They settled for diversity and inclusion, all of these buzzwords that come at us every day, on terms that consign most women to the same old oppression, especially since the 1990s, you write, and I quote, hegemonic currents of emancipatory movements became allied with neoliberal forces aiming to financialize the capitalist economy. And this is a pattern with very loud Canadian echoes. Do you detect signs of a post-pandemic movement away from this very liberal and latterly neoliberal form of feminism?
Yeah, I guess I would say, I want to say that first of all, there were always other feminisms. That this is a critique of a hegemonic, dominant current of feminism, one that has been elevated by the media to represent feminism per se, as if there were nothing else. But there have always been currents of Black feminism, of socialist and Marxist feminism, of indigenous feminism, all kinds of feminism that wanted to represent what we called in the little pamphlet you displayed a feminism for the 99% instead of one for the 1%. Now, I think this whole question of hegemony that we were just talking about is relevant here too. I think to me, 2016 is a watershed. It's the Brexit vote and the Trump victory, right? I don't know if you had an event of earth-shaking comparability in Canada or not, but for us, this was a huge year. And because it exploded the hegemony of progressive neoliberalism. Who was the candidate that Trump defeated? Hillary Clinton, the icon of liberal feminism. The person who wrote a book called It Takes a Village and gave behind closed door speeches to Wall Street for six-figure fees, promising that she wasn't going to change any of the rules to regulate derivatives. So it seemed to me that both Brexit in one way and the Trump victory, and by the way, when I say the Trump victory, I want to say Trump plus Sanders, because there were two revolts against the neoliberal establishment that went on that year. There was the Trump revolt against regressive neoliberalism, and there was the Sanders revolt against progressive neoliberalism, the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party. Okay, in other words, I think that progressive neoliberalism was kind of exposed as a sham, as all of these working class people defected. Whether they went to Trump or Sanders made a great difference to me politically, but from this point of view, it was they were all rejecting progressive neoliberalism. And that meant that liberal feminism faced a kind of crisis as well. And interestingly, it's around this time that in the US, you start getting the election to Congress of a whole slew of Sanders type female congresswomen, the so-called squad, AOC, more recently Cori Bush, all of these, it's a growing group. Now they represent something else. They are certainly feminists, but they're not like single issue feminists. They are feminists who have a broader critique of the political economy. Some of them claim to be democratic socialists. I'm not 100% sure what exactly they mean when they use that phrase, nor am I sure what Bernie Sanders means when he uses that phrase, but there's something in the air. It's probably the case in the global South that there have been what we can call for shorthand feminism for the 99% in a much more visible way, because in ex-colonial countries that have been ravaged by colonialism before and neo-imperialism today, it's much harder to sort of segregate some special class of things called women's issues from everything else that is, destroying people's lives. So I think there's a lot of feminism going on. And we wrote that manifesto, Feminism for the 99%, in hopes of sort of giving it a name, drawing the lines, saying, we're at a fork in the road. Liberal feminism is seemingly collapsing. Okay, that might have been an exaggeration, but it's in trouble. Here's something else. You're already doing it, but now let's all just do it together, and et cetera, et cetera. So I think in general that in a time of crisis like this, and now I'm talking about the hegemonic phase of the crisis, not the structural phase, but how people react. I think that all the established political orientations begin to bleed support, and there are opportunities for good alternatives to develop, as well as some of the very nasty alternatives that are unfortunately are also developing.
Well, that leads to the second group of leftists you're a bit critical of, which would be, your conventional Marxists. Their moldy models focused exclusively on capital-labor relations at the expense of all the hidden abodes that you've documented so well. And without those hidden abodes, capitalism couldn't exist. So these Marxists characteristically ignored three big ways the system free rides on those it deems outside itself. First of all, as you mentioned in your talk so well, without the unpaid labor, mainly of women, it could not function because their largely unremunerated work creates the very entities, workers whose labor power capitalism necessarily must exploit, not to speak of all the other caring functions that you also enumerated. And without the supposedly free resources supplied by non-human nature, there would not similarly be any commodities upon which capitalism could profit. And without public power, what we misleadingly call private enterprise could neither come into being nor perpetuate itself. Now, I'm wondering, can the upshot of these three hard-hitting feminist and eco-socialist critiques still be called Marxism?
I do call myself a Marxist. I'm not an orthodox Marxist, but I don't know. It's kind of awkward to start piling up adjectives. I'm a democratic, socialist, feminist, eco, something Marxist. So sometimes it's just easier to say, yes, I'm a Marxist, but of a different kind. And I'll tell you, though, how I think about this. And now this is going to sound absurdly presumptuous, so forgive me in advance. But, Einstein didn't refute Newton. He resituated Newtonian physics in a broader frame within the field of objects of a certain size, not too small, not too big, et cetera, et cetera. Newtonian physics works pretty damn well, but there's a larger field, and so it's not the whole anymore. Something like that is what I've been trying to do with Marx. Not that I would compare myself to Einstein, please, but I think that a lot of what Marx has to say about the official economy is right. It's just that the background conditions are presumed. And he was very upfront about this in Capital, which presents an abstract, idealized picture that assumes that certain other things are in place that are not even talked about. And so I see myself as resituating the Marxian analysis of the capitalist economy, not refuting it.
Okay, thank you. And finally, I wanted to get to the tough words you have to say about anarchists and neo-anarchists that have been so prominent in the post-1990s left through such movements as Alter Globalization and Occupy and a host of identity-based leftisms. They fall short, you suggest, in three ways. First of all, although they preach a gospel of domination, in practice, only a tiny minority of people can devote their lives to demonstrating. And for a good many people, demonstrating means the risk of deportation. Secondly, although they preach a radical democracy, in practice, in the absence of much clear structure, it's actually hard to tell how decisions are made. And third, although they preach challenging the foundations of capitalism, they deliver an unsustainable constant meeting guaranteed to burn people out rather than shaking any of those foundations. So could we add to that list a fourth one derived from the pandemic itself, which is that contrary to the anarchist tradition, we have been taught in the harshest possible way that we need a global public power guided by science with the capacity to enforce measures necessary for the survival and flourishing of the species. So what is your take on where the pandemic has left this powerful libertarian current of contemporary new leftism?
Well, that's a very thoughtfully constructed question, I have to say. I mean, I don't know about you, but I teach at the New School, and I don't know if this is still the case because of the pandemic, I haven't been teaching in person. I will be starting in January, but I was sort of suddenly all my students were anarchists at a certain point. And it kind of drove me crazy, I have to say. And, we were, close right there, a few blocks from Occupy, from Zuccotti Park and so on. And, that whole movement had such enormous charisma. And David Graeber had such enormous charisma, and he's was a great scholar, but that there was just this thing in the air that to be really radical, you couldn't have votes, you couldn't have spokespeople, you couldn't have leadership, you couldn't have a program, a set of demands, et cetera, et cetera. And I just feel that there was maybe there still is a certain crisis of organization on the left. And it's as if people think that because we don't want a Leninist party, therefore we don't want any party, therefore we don't want any sort of political structures. There's got to be something in between, which I think we still are searching for. So I agree with all of the points that you raised about the failings of anarchism. I also agree very strongly with your last point, that again, if you wanted a textbook demonstration of why we need public powers, the pandemic is it. I mean, maybe the most serious thing to say about anarchism is that the problem is it's too focused on the state. States can be very oppressive, but weakening states, what are you then going to have? ExxonMobil is going to run things. Google is going to run things. I mean, Facebook, so anyway, we have to put together the corporations, the states, the democratic publics, and come up with new models for how public power is constituted and exercised. And I don't think those have been seriously thought through. Now, having said all of that, I know from my students, they believe that a lot of what I have just said to you and what I've written on this subject is is much too simple-minded, doesn't take into account the great sophisticated new forms of anarchist theorizing that have gone on, which I confess that I'm not deeply immersed in. So I decided next year to teach a course on socialism and anarchism. And I'm going to learn more about it, and ask me again. Maybe I'll have something different to say.
GDH Cole has a book from the 1930s, I think, called Socialism and Anarchism. I'm not sure I'd recommend it. But
Well, I'm going to have a look at it. But I'm going to go back and read the Marx Bakunin debates and all of
yeah.
stuff. There's a lot of the Paris Commune discussions. There's a lot of really interesting literature, so it'll be fun.
I'll just ask one more thing, and then we should turn it over to our audience. So if you're in the audience, you want to ask a question, you might, start getting ready. The one thing I really, really appreciated about your book, Capitalism, a Conversation, was the way you really went after the moralizing, finger pointing, talking down to rural and working class people with the insinuation that they were culturally and backward and stupid. I'm quoting you. And I think you say that's a surefire way to generate resentment, not solidarity. So if you dismiss people as a basket of deplorables, they're, lo and behold, they're apt to tune you out. And I think, as you point out in your talk and in the questions, many people, working people, have been shaken loose from their accustomed ideological patterns and are desperate for some policy or person who can offer plausible sounding alternatives to precarity and dispossession. But if leftists keep on talking to them in a condescending manner, as in, we know the answers and you're too dumb and prejudiced and gullible to see them, well, leftists are just undermining their own project. And I think you point out the shallowness of that stance because, as you write, it grossly exaggerates the extent to which the problems are inside people's head, while missing the depth of the structural institutional forces that undergird them. And yet I was taken by a comment from your sparring partner in Capitalism, a Conversation, in which he raises the challenge, might there not be a risk here of minimizing the popular patterns that still call out for critique, and most particularly prejudicial patterns of racism and homophobia and sexism? Isn't this a very delicate line to walk, in other words?
Yeah, probably so. But I think it's a question of weighting and balance. Look, part of it is a diagnostic question. My diagnosis is that the structural and institutional bases of racism, homophobia, gender, misogyny, whatever, are sort of where it's really at. And that, look, we hear a lot about cancel culture, about wokeness, about all of this kind of stuff. Most of what you hear is right-wing disinformation, stigmatizing of the left, but not all. There is a problem on the left, in my opinion. And maybe I'm not even talking about the left. I don't know what is left, really. But let's put it this way. A lot of progressive people I think, overemphasize the interpersonal, the bad behavior, the bad ideas, the bad language, et cetera, et cetera. And that I'm not trying to defend any of that bad stuff. It's bad. But if you try to build a politics, on that, you become one of these Puritan scolds, you know. And this is sort of, to me, what the essence of Hillary Clinton was, with that finger pointing, the deplorables. I just read a book I want to recommend. I think it's well known because it's already been listed for many prizes, but Keeanga Yamada Taylor's new book called Race for Profit, which is about housing. There is the most beautiful account of what the term structural racism or institutional racism ought to mean. There's a great political economy of real estate, of housing, of government programs, of the real estate industry, of developers, appraisers, all of this, in which race is at the center of. So there are ways to address questions of race that don't first and foremost consist in calling out individuals. And let me be clear, because I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not talking about, I don't care if people call out the David Dukes and the Richard Spencers. I don't know if those names mean anything to you, know, the real Nazi white supremacists. But there's a difference between that and people who might vote for Trump. And I've called them opportunistic racists, not necessarily principled card-carrying racists. But, you know, they haven't gone to Ivy League colleges. They don't know that you're supposed to say BIPOC instead of a Black or African American. You know, there's just, we are too caught up in this level. I feel very strongly about it. I feel it's a disaster. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for this question and answer. And I hope now we'll get some questions from our audience. And I'm seeing one from Lindsay Allison. Lindsay.
Thank you. Thank you very much also for organizing the series. I really enjoy the series, and they always reassure my sense of optimism in the world. But it's no, it's very, very interesting. And thank you very much for the presentation today. I must admit, my observations are very pedestrian. I'm a finance person. I work in finance and have done for many years. And one of the points about COVID, that when it started, I mean, moving aside from the horror of the disease itself, but just from what I perceive to be the the discussion of the system of capitalism. One of the interesting things that we witnessed in Canada well, it was across the world, but just a massive response from central banks, the massive financial response from governments. I remember in early March, we couldn't sell treasury bills to pay, to pay salaries, which is unheard of. And then all of a sudden, the world was awash with cash. So in Canada, I don't know what the situation is like in the States, but I'm not defending the system, but in Canada right now in 2020 and 2021, by the most common metrics of financial average household financial wealth. So that would be household disposable income, total household per capita income, or household savings rates. They've gone up. So moving aside from the horror of the disease, and I'm not, but in strict financial terms, Canadians are actually, the average Canadians, Canadians on the average are better off. And it doesn't seem, it's just like the extreme rich are so much more rich that they're skewing the data. So from my perspective, the real crisis starts now as we start to reopen, because the way that people were paid with these, and Canada is actually having trouble moving off of the benefits, or however you want to describe it, that they began to pay. So how Canadians were paid, the way they spent their money, how and where they worked. I mean, my industry has effectively become a cottage industry. We all work from home with our fish tanks running in the back, So to me, the real crisis of capitalism starts now, or, one of the real challenge, or a real challenge to capitalism begins now, which is, what's the next step? Do we go back to how it was? Do we forge ahead with something new? What does that look like? And who's going to influence that? So I have to admit, I really did appreciate I thought your presentation. I thought you had a lot of very sage advice and very fascinating, observations. But I would also probably say that it's not all bad. At least there have been. There's certainly tools that we're seeing now that I don't think people ever envisaged before. And thank goodness modern monetary theory is kicking around now too, because that might that might end up helping governments make decisions. But again, thank you very much for your presentation.
Well, thank you, Lindsay, for your comment, your question. And I mean, I guess I have a couple of thoughts about it. I mean, one is that the massive dumping or issuing of money, of feeding money into the system, was whether it was done in the Chinese mode or in the Canadian or whatever. That's another. That is an example of what we were talking about before, of non-neoliberal policy. All of a sudden, the idea of austerity disappeared, right? And now we had a need for stimulus, for pump priming, for income support, and so on. And when you ask what happens next, it'll be, you would think, again, if we lived in a rational world, that you wouldn't any longer be hearing from what Krugman calls the deficit hawks. But alas, we have one in the United States Senate who is single-handedly blocking the passage of Biden's social spending bill on the grounds that it's too much debt to take on, which in this moment is an absurd idea. The other thing I want to say, and I can't comment on the Canadian data, but I can tell you for the US that the picture that you drew of sort of things getting better for everyone is not the case. It's a 2/3, 1/3 society. You basically have, like, let's call it not the 1%, but the 10%, or maybe it's 20%, whatever, the professional managerial stratum, people who have good pension funds or 401ks. Of course, the stock market is zooming. They're not out spending lavishly on vacations and at restaurants and at the opera and so on and so forth. So yes, a lot of savings and yet a lot of appreciation. But for the 2/3, for the working classes, it's been quite the opposite. Now, we probably don't have anywhere near as effective of an income support system and savings safety net and so on as you have. But my impression is that in many parts of the world, this has been a disaster for livelihood as well as for health. Where are we going back forward? I don't think we're going back. I don't see that as a possibility, and that's the sort of populist trope: build back better, or well, that's the Biden, or make America great again, take back control. You know, I don't think we're going back, and I think the question of, and as I said before, it's hard to imagine how things could really stabilize as they are now, because too much is out of the bag, so to speak. But that doesn't give us a clear picture of what might come next. I mean, I could, in an abstract way, enumerate the possibilities from, like, you know, the sort of disintegration of civilization, the breaking up into warlords and, you know, lifeboat, and from, you know, to anything from that to, I don't know, some new forms of fascism, to, I don't know, to some form of socialism, to some new form of capitalism that we can't imagine. And I think if there's going to be a new form of capitalism, it's got to, in some sense or another, be green. And that's so hard to understand. I don't know, could 4/5 of the global capitalist class simply gang up on the fossil fuel energy sector and expropriate them and say, you're out of business? That's what they need to do. yeah, you have a
Yeah,
thought
I can
about that?
respond to that. So
Sure.
when I began work in the 90s, late 90s, this was an actual ethics question. If if you could get 5% with pick your greens, save the animal, save the world, or 6% with nuclear arms, gun producing bad company,
Yeah.
which one is the right investment? All other things equal, you had to pick the bad one. It was your moral duty. Right now, I am floored and delighted, absolutely delighted, but absolutely floored to see there's trillions of dollars now in these green funds. And oil companies, if it's not green, they're actually having real problems getting capital. Of course, in the Canadian context, it doesn't work so much. I mean, we have a certain hypocrisy here because we've got a very strong oil-based economy. But it does seem to be taking off. It's really quite interesting. Are they going to gang up? The university funds, I mean, they're starting to do that right now. They're starting to pull out, and it's certainly making a difference. And I think, but one of the big questions though is that for the oil companies is that if I have an investment that will continue to extract oil, but does so in a much more responsible manner, should I get financing? It's an interesting moral question. I mean, anyway, so it's we're nowhere near where we should be, I think, but it's certainly taking flight, and I cannot believe the amount of money that is now tied up in green investments. It's really quite something.
Can I add something here? Trying to look into the future, that the post-pandemic future, and I'd like to run this past you, Nancy. On the one hand, I can see a kind of 1920s thing going on here, where we've gone through this enormous crisis, and people want some kind of settlement of it, and they want their sacrifices to be recognized and honored. And I think there's an enormous exhaustion. I think people are just terribly tired of this. And I think for millions of people, there'll be, perhaps over 700,000 in your country alone, there's this terrible weight of bereavement and grief. So it does remind me a little bit of the 1920s, with all of the immense dangers and possibilities of that decade, where you do have an awful lot of unpaid bills from this pandemic. People who were said, you're essential. I don't think they're really going to then forget that they were essential and say, okay, we'll go back to being paid terrible wages under horrible conditions. I think there's actually been a really interesting refusal of work going on, where people are saying, well, we're just not going to do that job anymore. It's not worth it. Our lives are too important. Our time is too important. So I think that's a really encouraging thing. And I think there are signs of enormous encouragement in the rising strike levels, and a new interest in trade unionism, a new willingness to resist. So I guess I would like to have, maybe conclude the night with a kind of hopeful message, but I would like to get your own prognostications on can this be a new moment of resistance for working people?
Yes. We've quoted Gramsci several times. So let's also bring in that other old chestnut we owe to him, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Yes. I don't know whether I'm not making predictions that I feel that, this is all going to come out in a good way, but I feel very energized. For me, this is a great time to be alive. I haven't felt that way since the 1960s. So, I mean, you get a sense that all around you, people are defecting from the system, including these great points that you just made about work refusal, unionization, people holding out for higher wages or safer or more interesting work. That's been not anything I would have predicted. That's been really something. Black Lives Matter even though it has, I think there's a lot of disappointment that there haven't been concrete forms of measurable progress, that our Congress has not passed a voting rights bill or a police reform bill, and yesterday's elections, or Tuesday's elections, did not produce victories for defund the police, which I happen to think was not a great slogan. So, even though I supported the idea behind it, the Republicans knew how to play that beautifully, and they did. Anyway, that movement, was the first mass militant national movement, and not even international movement of militant anti-racism in decades. So, there are things going on. As I say, I think feminism is going through a kind of reckoning. And I see more visible alternatives to liberal feminism than I did. Eco-politics and environmentalism is undergoing a huge, interesting change. It's no longer a single issue movement. Now it's focused on questions like environmental racism or environmental justice, and connected up with the defense of social reproduction and communities, what the Catalan theorist Joan Martinez Alia used to call the environmentalism of the poor, as opposed to that environmentalism of the rich, which, wilderness protection and all. So there's a lot happening that has potential.
Mhm.
The problem is there's also, anti-mask, anti-vax, a lot of insanity that, there's a mass hysteria in the United States in some circles against the teaching of critical race theory in elementary schools, which is another one of these insane, fantasies that our right wing generates and our mainstream Republicans are happy to exploit. So it's a mixed picture, but there are many good things in this picture, and it's a great time to be alive and to fight for what you believe in.
On that note, I'd like to thank you, Nancy, so much for this wonderful, wonderful presentation and question and answer. And thank you for all the terrific work that you've done to explore critical theory and the better world that we might create. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ian, and thanks to all of you for attending, and it's been very enjoyable.